Thank you for inviting me this morning to talk at the BBRO conference. I'm presenting the Healthy Harvest campaign, which is an important initiative launched by the NFU. I'm sure many of you will have heard about it and possibly seen some of the things I'm going to talk about today. It's just a whistle-stop really through the aims of the campaign and what we're trying to do. The campaign was launched at Cereals last year, 2014, but actually the background to this campaign really began probably a year or so before that, when the restriction on neonicotinoids was brought in at European level. And that, alongside the issues around the regulation of pesticides more broadly, and some of the challenges we were facing with managing blackgrass control, issues around slug control, metaldehyde, etc., were sort of clearly presenting a real challenge for you as growers, and the NFU membership were raising concerns about this. And we knew we needed to look at this in a different way, rather than just tackling individual issues, which obviously we would have to deal with. We felt we needed to put together something more holistic that outlined the broader challenges with regards to the availability of plant protection products. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a few of the slides that we're using to kind of articulate the issue that we're seeing with plant protection products. I'll begin at a fairly general, very general, very high level place, which is crop production. If we look, this is a graph that displays the red line is UK crop production, and the blue line is crop production in the other sort of major producing areas of the world. And you can clearly see that the UK line is flatlining, if not actually going down very slightly. Whereas you can see there's a broader response in the sort of other larger producing areas. And I think that red line is reflective of what we'd see at a broader European level as well, which we would say potentially, although it's obviously a complicated issue, it illustrates maybe the fact that in Europe there are considerable challenges to our ability to produce and to keep up with the demands of a growing world population. Then if we take that down to another thing, which is to look at the UK trade in food and drink. These are 2012 prices. We have just very recently updated this graph, but this is 2012. And we can see a growing gap between imports and exports on food and drink, which is indicative, again, that what you can see, that gap is continuing to widen. And it's quite important to realise this is actually during a period where the UK population has grown significantly. So not only are we struggling to keep that gap from ever widening, but also it's against the wider context of a growing population in the UK, which is obviously reflective of a considerably growing global population. Now, while that is complicated, there are a number of issues that we feel need to be highlighted. And why are we using this when we're talking about plant protection products? Well, we feel that plant protection products are, and you'll know this, are a critical building block and a critical technology in terms of being able to have yield stability and to guarantee that continuing progression of yield production. Now, if we actually start to look at what this looks like at a European level, this is a pretty interesting graph, because this starts to illustrate the challenge that we're facing. Here in about 2000, 2001, we're looking at this. This is the DG Sanko graph. This is the official European graph. We think actually there's an argument around about 900 to 950 actives were registered at this point. And this is actually the point when the European regulation was introduced, 91414, kind of had its effect. And we can see quite quickly a dramatic fall in the number of actives that were being registered or continue to be registered. and that decline has continued. This graph ends in 2009 because that's when the most recent piece of European regulation was introduced. Now, it's probably fair to say this, in this case, this dramatic fall was probably due to manufacturers, in many cases, deciding it wasn't worth continuing with certain products, not necessarily that those products wouldn't have passed the regulatory barriers, but actually it probably wasn't worth continuing with them because there were suitable products available and the cost would be preclusive. But the overall point is that when we look at this, we're down to about, in the UK, about 250 actives left from possibly a fall from somewhere near 900 or just over back in 2000. So over 14 years, the crop protection toolbox has fallen by 2/3 to possibly 3/4. And that's reflective at a broader level. We can see the share of crop protection R&D in Europe as compared to the global investment back in the 1980s was 33.3. It is now, in the period 2005 to 2014, 7.7. So, and a lot of that is related to biotech, I think it's fair to say. The fact that in the rest of the developed world and more broadly, we're seeing the availability of biotech and the link between crop protection products and biotech, whereas obviously Europe is being left behind in that sense. What it means is that there is not only is there a diminishing range of products available, there's also not a clear pipeline of new products coming through. And my final illustration is that the number of new crop protection products registered at European level has dropped by 70% in that same time period. So whereas we were probably seeing about 8 new actives registered at European level back in the 1980s and 90s, we're now seeing 1 or 2. And there's no guarantee that they will actually be suitable for UK. There's obviously at a broader European level, it may be they're suitable for other parts of Europe, but no guarantee they'll be suitable for the UK. So putting all that together, the NFU with other partners, CPA, AIC, and a wider group of supporting organisations felt there was a need to make the point that actually if we carried on like this, it was going to be very difficult for UK farmers, UK growers to be able to sustain the good work they were doing in terms of production. So the Healthy Harvest campaign was launched, and there were some really key aims of the Healthy Harvest campaign, some key focuses. The most important was to challenge the European regulation on plant protection products, and particularly actually in the short term to deal with the issues of endocrine disruption. And I'll come on to that in a minute. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are aware of this issue by now because NFU and partnering with BBRO and others have been trying to raise this issue. But the key aim was to see change at a European level. What is potentially good news is I think we're hearing that we have forced the Commission's hand to some degree in terms of getting a potential review of 1107 at the end of this year. So that's the European pesticide regulation. So actually, that is one of the key aims we had in this process. Already we're beginning to see some progress on that. By no means is that the end of the campaign because actually that process will be extremely complicated and difficult. To deal with UK-specific measures, while generally the UK position is pretty good, we are concerned that there are products available to European growers that are not available to growers in the UK because often the regulator places additional barriers on those products coming into the UK and adds additional levels of data requirement. And again, I think we're beginning to hear there's potentially good progress on that front as well. So that's really helpful to hear, and I think will make a difference in terms of getting some key products into the UK more quickly. And then to emphasise, and this is an area I think we're still beginning to look at how we tackle, although we've made some progress certainly to emphasise the importance of plant protection products in terms of food production. So I think it's that ability to talk to retailers and to food producers and even to consumers when necessary about why plant protection products are important, why we need them, what they do, the benefits that are derived from them, and those benefits are considerable, but actually in many cases have not been well talked about and articulated over the last 20 or so years, and we feel we need to engage in those discussions, and we certainly feel that growers are really important in that process when they're talking to people, when they're meeting with retailers, when they're meeting with other people in the food production chain. The opportunity to talk about why we use plant protection products is something we all need to be thinking about. So to promote good practice and stewardship, it's important that while making all these asks, we're very clear that all the work that the voluntary initiative and other stewardship campaigns have done doesn't go away, that it should be recognised that UK growers and farmers have been ahead of the curve on this in many cases, but also that we continue to put down world-beating standards in terms of stewardship. IPM is an important area at the moment at a European level, and it's really good. You might have seen in the last week or so, the VI did a press launch saying we're heading up towards 2 million hectares now covered by the sort of newly launched VI IPM plans. So again, it's not about, what we're not asking for here is a lowering of standards. What we're saying is we need plant protection products in order to deliver healthy and wholesome food. And then to strategically compile evidence of the impacts of the plant protection regulation. And this is where we've been working with BBRO and AHDB and others, because we felt there was a need to do something to articulate this issue in a way that would make regulators and the wider stakeholders take notice. A key part of this was the Anderson's reports, which you will probably all be familiar with, so I will whistle through the key findings of that work, commissioned jointly by NFU, CPA and AIC. They estimated that in the next 5 to 7 years, of the 250 UK registered active ingredients, between 40 and 87 are likely to be lost. They did their assessments on 40 as the highly likely, but there was another sort of 47 products that were at some level of risk. And this is really important, they looked at what that meant, not just in terms of farm income, but what it meant in the wider chain. What does it mean to food production? What does it mean to UK PLC? Because MPs and MEPs are interested in these kind of figures. And to be honest, we were astounded by some of the information that came out, particularly when we believe the Anderson's report is probably a very realistic, if not conservative estimate of the potential impacts. Up to 44,000 jobs lost in the UK in the wider food chain. 36% loss in farm incomes if the regulation continues in the direction that it is going. And £2.8 billion in gross value added is lost per annum as a result of losing just 40 active ingredients, effectively reducing the UK store covered by about 20%. And then in addition to that, and you'll also be aware of this work, I'm sure, the work of again, we've been involved with AHDB and BBRO. BBRO helped contribute to the Anderson's work, and have also, I know there's been a lot of work gone on with this AHDB report, looking specifically at the issue of endocrine disruption. And within that piece of work, identifying that probably a realistic direction of travel, around about 905 million wiped off UK farm gate value in the years following the implementation of the definition, which is probably looking at about 2017 onwards, up to 3.3 billion if we got a particularly conservative approach to the definition of endocrine disruption off UK alone. Now the good news is the Commission does seem to be hearing these concerns, and we have had a major win in terms of the fact we actually had a consultation, because they've never really consulted on any pesticide-related issue before, and actually they have been willing to have that consultation and to launch a full-scale impact assessment. So this work is yielding benefits because it's actually providing evidence of economic impact, production impact, and jobs and social impact, which we believe is critical to getting traction in this discussion. Very quickly, and I know Mark's going to cover this in more detail, these are just some of the things pulled out of the Anderson's report in terms of the potential plant protection products that Anderson's proposed could be lost. You can see the columns. These look at some key areas of disease, pests, weeds and diseases. This is the sort of percentage area of the crop affected and the potential yield loss that could be seen. And without going through the details of this, because I know Mark will cover some of these, I think the key point is that what we're seeing a degradation of the overall armoury. So there's a real concern over resistance and issues, particularly around losing things like some of the triazole fungicides and the actual impact that could have down the line in terms of resistance and actually the damage that could cause. Key things like loss of cypermether in here, and also neonicotinoids is obviously a critical issue. Anderson's didn't believe the current situation with neonicotinoids would progress any further, but we have to be aware that that remains a risk if we don't make concerted efforts to demonstrate the importance of these actives and to challenge the scientific basis. Also important to note that in the wider global context, this is something we're also trying to emphasise, climate change and other issues and the broader trade, imports and exports at a worldwide level are creating other risks. And Exeter University did a recent study and they estimate that potentially in the next 30 years there could be epidemic levels of certain invasive pests and diseases. And I know, again, I think Mark will talk about that in more detail in some of his presentations. But it's an important thing we need to look at in the broader context, and we need to remember when we're talking about these products that it's not just what we already have to deal with, it's also the risk of things coming in and not having a sufficient toolbox to manage those risks as if they are introduced. So in terms of involvement, just really summing up, how can you be involved? Well, I'd like to thank anyone who's been involved already in terms of responding to the endocrine disruption, and anyone who's been talking to their MPs or MEPs about any of the issues around Healthy Harvest. But some key things. All the information around the Healthy Harvest campaign is freely accessible online. So you can go onto NFU online, you can look for the Healthy Harvest campaign, you can find the Anderson's report, you can look at those figures that we put up, you can find the Anderson's booklet, the Healthy Harvest booklet produced by NFU. And if you need to get copies of that, you can speak to NFU locally about getting copies. And that gives you key issues and key things to be discussing with sort of individuals who you believe you can influence. Stay in touch over strategic lobbying. We will be looking to engage members. We believe there'll be consultations coming up later this year where members' voices need to be heard, certainly at a UK level. And obviously it's not just about NFU membership for all farmers and growers. UK general election does give us an opportunity to emphasise some of these points. Evidence-based decision-making, generally the UK are good on that, but it is the politicians need to be reminded that we need to work on that basis, because there is a lot of pressure for them just to do the easy thing around pesticides. A level playing field, there is an issue with UK regulation and not having an entirely level playing field. And that does need, that needs to be emphasised. If you get the opportunity, we need an open approach to what's called mutual recognition in the UK. So we're on a level playing field. We faced a risk with Vidate last year that actually, because of additional legislation or additional levels of risk assessment at a UK level, that we potentially might not have had that product. really, and through lobbying and other activity, it became quite apparent that position was untenable. But actually, the point was we should never have really been brought to that place in the first place when other European countries were happily able to access the product. Need to be pushing and continue to push for that EU review of key regulation, because MPs talk to MEPs and we need them to engage on this issue. And finally, to make the positive messaging about value and importance of plant protection products. We do need to keep emphasising they have a value, and also we need to emphasise the high levels of stewardship through red tractor assurance, work of voluntary initiative, things like completing the IPM plans, annual assessments of sprays. We need to remind people that all that is going on and all that goes beyond just what regulation requires, and it's a demonstration of a professional industry that takes its need to steward these products very seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. Clearly some, an important issue and some startling numbers that Don's put forward there. We've got time for a couple of questions. Daniel and Gina are around with roving microphones, so if anybody's got a question for Don, please hands up and they'll find you with a microphone. It's a bit of a job looking into the light here, but maybe one at the front here. Can I ask, hands up in future, perhaps if you could hold your programs up, it's just easier to see. Thank you.
It's not really a question, it's more a comment. Sorry, my name is Chris Sutton, by the way. You've shown some rather concerning statistics and so on, but it just seems to me as an observation that those bodies which speak on behalf of the industry, AICC and NFU and so on and so forth, I appreciate what you're doing, but unfortunately those figures show that at present you're losing the argument that the political lobbyists and the environmental lobbyists are better at their job than we are at our job, or frankly the NFU and AICC are just not doing a good enough job. And unless we change our tack and be much more proactive and aggressive, I see it's just going to get worse. And it just seems also, it's not just on an EU basis, but on 2 or 3 occasions you've said that we in the UK are actually also falling behind our EU partners. And that's not a good sign for the future either.
Can I, yeah, I mean, I understand your point, and that's exactly what the Healthy Harvest campaign is about. The reality is that we've probably allowed the NGOs and the group that are pushing against pesticides to speak. That's not that we haven't been involved, but I think we've realised that we need to tackle this issue in a different way. I think there's been an aspect in which they have controlled the airways and the communication channels for a very long time. And actually, that is what the Healthy Harvest campaign is about. In truth, it'll take time to make the changes. What's interesting is when you go and talk to the Commission, this is exactly what they're asking the industry to do. Now, you can say, well, shouldn't they be doing this? I think we face a situation where regulators, unfortunately, tend to rely on the industry to give them the bullets to fire these days in terms of making their case. But actually, the Commission have been very positive about this campaign, actually, at a broader level, in terms of actually, particularly the work of the Anderson's report and the work of AHDB, in terms of giving them something to push back with. Both big bits of work that have cost considerable amounts of money to put forward. And I do take your point, and I do think we've got to do more, but that's the reason for the campaign. That's the reason, thankfully, BBRO have given us the platform to talk about it. But absolutely, everyone needs to engage with this. We need to take all the opportunities we can. And actually, there's an aspect of buying time. If we can slow down the regulation as well as trying to get it changed, then that buys time in terms of keeping these products available on the market for new developments and new technologies to come through. So hopefully that kind of, maybe it doesn't address your concerns, but it's recognising that you know there is a strategic approach here, and that actually we are trying to change the way in which we deal with these issues.
Thank you. Any other questions for Don?
Yes, thank you. Tom Allen Stevens, CPM magazine. Don, given the Liz Truss has recently said that all decisions, government decisions on these matters will be based on sound scientific evidence. Given that the derogation that was applied for neonicotinoids for autumn 2014 was denied not on the basis of sound scientific evidence, but on the basis of 4 million emails received by Number 10 against it, how much confidence should we have in the government that they are going to fight our corner in Europe?
Difficult question in the sense that, I mean, I think to be fair to the UK government, they have on neonicotinoids at a broader level, they have tried to make their position clear at a European level. So I think we're relatively, I think we've seen them take a basis in sound science at a European level. However, I think we do need, that does need to actually come down to action at a UK level when there's an opportunity to allow an emergency authorization or whatever else. The UK regulator needs to demonstrate what it's put forward at European level as also being consistent with what it does at UK level, and we need to continue to challenge them over that. That actually they do have that level of consistency between the two positions that they take.
Okay, one final question at the back there.
Thank you, James Black, a farmer from Suffolk. Don, how much effort is the NFU putting into getting Commission officials over here into the UK? Because whilst you ask us to do what we can from a lobbying point of view, most of these regulations are drafted in Brussels, generally speaking, by people who have very little direct contact with what's going on the ground. And I think we ought to be making much bigger effort in getting those officials over here, showing them what's going on in the UK and what we're doing. And I would be interested to hear from you how much effort you're putting into actually getting officials here and when the next delegation's coming this way, please.
That's a nice put at the end there. Right, directly in terms of getting officials over, obviously NFU is a larger organisation than just me, so I couldn't give you that information now, but I will, if you want, I will come back with that information because I'd need to check within NFU what's going on. I think you've got a good point though, which is that it is a real challenge getting Commission delegates out of the Commission building in many cases. Actually getting them out of Brussels is hard work. And it's something that we've worked on. We have worked on quite hard at the Brussels end. We think that's why it's so important when you get the opportunity to talk to MEPs, that people do talk to their MEPs and emphasise their concerns. There is effort to try to get the Commission delegates out to farm and to look at some of the issues. That said, it's difficult to get them out to the UK. But it's certainly something we are putting effort into doing in terms of getting them exposure to agriculture and the issues of agriculture. And it's something I know we're increasingly trying to put effort into. That's also why NFU, in a sense, uniquely, we obviously have a large group of farm members, elected representatives who can actually talk to Commission officials who are regularly discussing with them the issues they're seeing on their farms and the issues that they're confronting. So they do have to come face to face with not just representatives of farmers, but also farmers themselves.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on. Thank you very much to Don for his presentation, and thanks for your engagement with those questions. I think the thing that's highlighted to me is that this is a really important area. There's the opportunity for us to up our level of engagement, and I guess that's incumbent on all of us here to stay in touch with the Healthy Harvest programme. As Don said, that information is available online. Let's keep in touch with the lobbying strategy and do our bit to engage with MPs, MEPs, and anybody to tell them, how professional this industry is and how we take a responsible approach to stewardship of these chemistries. So, thank you, Don.